Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I see people still coming in. I'm doing a little introduction, so you're not going to miss much. Um, my name is Gannit Ankori. I am the Henry and Lois Foster Director and Chief Curator of the Rose Art Museum. And it is a pleasure to welcome everyone to this special program, a special collaboration between the Rose Art Museum and Boston's wonderful ICA, Institute of Contemporary Art. Our conversation this evening will be devoted to Chiharu Shiota and the Boston-based projects that she has created both in the past and currently. And the impetus for the program is the fact that two very monumental installations are currently on view at the ICA's Watershed, curated by my friend and our guest, Ruth Erickson. And also, simultaneously, two of the artist's smaller sculptures are on display at the Rose Art Museum. And we will share a lot more about especially the Watershed installations, but also the two sculptures. Before we do, I'm thrilled to welcome my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Ruth Erickson, who will provide us many insights and fascinating behind-the-scenes information about her recent work with the artist herself. So a brief introduction about Ruth. Ruth is the Barbara Lee Chief Curator and Director of Curatorial Affairs at the ICA in Boston. She has been a driving force in the ICA's curatorial department since joining the museum in 2014, so over a decade. She's a curator and scholar of contemporary art, deeply committed to facilitating artists' projects, working to create meaningful exhibitions, books, programs that promote justice and inspire curiosity in the world. Just from that introduction, you can see how close the Rose is with the ICA and with Ruth's vision. Ruth received her graduate education in art history from the University of Pennsylvania, and I'm thrilled to be picking her brain and asking her questions about her recent work with Chiharu. But to get us started, we wanted to share images from the very, very first time that Chiharu Shiota showed her work in the greater Boston areas. And this was 2 decades ago, and it was at the Rose Art Museum. So a few biographical notes. Chiharu was born in Osaka, Japan in 1972. But since 1996, she moved to Germany, where she works. So this divided kind of belonging is something that I think Ruth might pick up on later when she discusses works like Home and the immigrant experience, etc. But I'm taking you to 2005. And for me, it's very special. And Ruth knows this because this is the very first time I saw Chiharu's work and the very first time I came to the Rose Art Museum. And now I'm the director. So it's really special. This is an installation, and I have a few installation shots that was part of a group exhibition conceptualized and installed by the brilliant curator Rafaela Plateau, who was chief curator at the Rose in 2005. She called her show Dreaming Now, and everything was about dreams, not just as an individual thing, but the collective unconscious and how dreams might tie us together, how they relate, how our imaginations also relate to the current moment. So the show included 9 international artists, among them Marina Abramovic. And this is important because she was Chiharu's teacher, but also William Kentridge, Maria Magdalena Campos Pons, and others. So Chiharu's installation was comprised of beds, these kind of institutional metal beds, a dozen beds. They had rumple sheets and pillows on them, but they were all intertwined with black woolen thread that kind of came down from the ceiling and the walls and the floors. Um, I think that what was very, very powerful was that it implicated the body of the viewers. From the beginning, her installations invited you as an audience member to be immersed in this space that she created. And Raphael, the curator used the term the spatial unconscious of the dream. So the fact that you came and it wasn't just a picture on the wall or a sculpture with limited space, it just encapsulated the entire lower rose gallery. And the other thing that is implicated was the artist's absent body. And it's not just the rumple sheet that are like traces of someone who slept there, but also in the opening, the artist was actually sleeping in the beds and then she left. So the memory of her presence and the presence of absence was there. The other thing that implicates the artist's body is the strings themselves, because it's a performative action of, she talks about in the catalog that Raffaella put together, she talks about drawing these lines in space with these black threads. And you kind of have to understand the kind of choreography of her body as she made those things. So this was my very first encounter with the Rose Art Museum, and I was blown away, and with Chiharu, and I was equally blown away. So I thought to hand the microphone to you, Ruth, and ask you, do you remember the first time you saw Chiharu work? And then just pass it on to talk about what it was like to work with her on your monumental installations.
Of course, yeah. Thank you so much, Gannit, for the invitation today and the collaboration. It's such a joy. And Madeline and Menen, who are behind the scenes. And I also want to thank my colleague at the ICA, Brianne Chappelle, who worked on this project with me, and Chiharu. And I'll say one thing that struck me when you were talking about her piece at the Rose is that 2005 was when Chiharu was first diagnosed with cancer. And she survived that, and then actually the cancer returned, and she's now in remission. But it was interesting to think of those beds that have this kind of institutional, almost hospital-like feel to them. And then this web kind of takes on this other relationship, as at that time, her ovarian cancer was, taking root. And I don't know exactly when her diagnosis came and her awareness of it. So, but it was striking in recalling that date and that experience of hers, which her illness has been become an important part of her work and a different body of work, and thinking about the entanglements of her body and love and loss. So that was just another anecdote. So I first saw Chiharu's work in a really kind of large scale in this project, The Key in the Hand, in 2015. And this was installed in the Japanese pavilion, the Japan pavilion at the 56th Venice Biennale. And, each of those pavilions in Venice in the Giardini have a different kind of architectural form. And the Japanese pavilion is sort of tucked up on this hill, and it has this very modernist exterior. And it's a pavilion that there are these kind of very large scale ones that are centrally along the avenue, and sometimes you can miss certain pavilions that are tucked in. And I remember making my way into the Japanese pavilion and encountering this scene, and I, like so many people, were just really awestruck, and it was physical, as you said, it was visual, it was immersive, everyone's phones were out, people were walking around of all, ages. And, I had heard about Chiharu Shiota, but I really had never seen this scale of work before. And I think that was the case for many American curators. She has had a career that has had major retrospectives and surveys all throughout Europe, all throughout the Asian world. And while she's had some key projects in the US, she just is less well known here than she is in so many other parts of the world. And so what this consisted of is this kind of red web of thread that attached to the ceiling and became this kind of canopy through which light filtered. And hanging on the thread were thousands of keys. And she had collected these keys, and some were, quite old. They looked like a key that would be used for a castle, and some were quite modern. And each of those keys, and I think that the kind of symbolism of the key and Chiharu's ability to identify objects that are really potent symbols is such a skill of hers. And insofar as the key locks to protect or unlocks to open is something about, what does one kind of protect and keep hidden versus what does one open a door to transition into. And these kind of transitory moments that so often she can find and embody in an object was very striking to me when I saw this installation. And almost suspended from this web of keys were these two boats. And I think anybody who has had the chance to go to Venice or knows Venice is a city of boats. You don't experience Venice without seeing boats and traveling in a boat. And I think the boat also is often associated with passage, both travel, but also passage to the afterlife. And the way that the boats were kind of seemed to be pointing upward and as if they're kind of taking off or lifting up to heaven was another really incredible aspect of this installation. So that, this was the kind of central component. And then I remember so well, there were four videos. And in 2015, I was actually traveling there with my first child, who was a year old. And they had these videos of these four young children who were telling the stories of their memories of their past, and they were quite young, 4 or 5. And what do you remember? When did you come into the world? What do you remember about being born? And as you can imagine, they were witty and frivolous and insightful and silly all at once. And so just the two of these two things, juxtaposed, really locked Chiharu Shiota in my head. And since 2015, I have been following the work, and when I'm able to see it either abroad or in the US or at one of her gallery shows, I've really been taken with it. And this was a few years before the ICA opened the ICA Watershed, but she was among the very first artists that the curators had brainstormed that is an artist that could kind of take on the space that is presented in the ICA's Watershed. And maybe we can just move forward to an image of
Yeah,
the watershed empty.
I wanted to, before we go to the empty watershed, which is a dramatic scene, I just wanted to say also that I read a lot about her use of the threads and her involvement with with Japanese aesthetics, and but there are always symbols or resonant objects that anyone can identify with. So the key to the home, the bed that means rest, also means a safe place in the home. The strings that are both cocoons that kind of protect, but also seem somehow like cobwebs that can entrap you. And I think that visceral understanding is part of what makes her uh, um, such a beloved artist and makes it so powerful for our audiences, because even if they don't know that she was born in Osaka or about the cancer or anything, you can pick up those elements. And the other thing is that already here with the keys, that in many places you have refugees who, um, in the Middle East, you have the story also in India and Pakistan after the partition, that people take the key to their home even when they become refugees. And then the ships could be the afterlife, but they could also uh, um, speak to the immigrant experience or living in between worlds. And at this point, she says, when I'm in Germany, I'm the Japanese woman, and when I'm in Japan, they call me the German woman. So all the and so many people nowadays experience that kind of internal fissure. So yeah, I think everything we look at, we can talk about forever. But now the reveal, the empty space of the watershed. Oh no.
Oh, good. We have these images too. Yeah, I
Amazing.
think it's so true. And I'll say that, when I think back to 2015, that was a moment in time where you had such dramatic movement of people via boats. And, there were a number of artists in that Venice Biennale. I think of a really powerful piece by Kader Attia that were doing projects around, what was being called as the refugee crisis. And I think that boat became a very potent motif in that way as well. Yeah, so when the ICA opened the watershed in 2018, and one of the most fun things that I get to do in my job is to invite an artist to see this space, because for an artist like Chiharu Shiota, who is such a spatial artist and really thinks about volume and sculpture, it is just this incredible container for possibility and for dreams. And I'll just introduce the watershed for those of you who may not know it or haven't had a chance to visit. This series of buildings that is in East Boston is in the East Boston Marina and Shipyard. And they were built by Bethlehem Steel in the middle part of the 20th century, the 30s and the 40s. Our space was built in the 1940s. And it was part of a number of complex of buildings that was around the repair of ships. And, there was a dry dock that would lift these huge boats out of the water to reveal their hulls. And then different of the facilities, in our case, it was working with copper and sheet metal and pipes to be able to then repair those boats. And so really that kind of physical history of what was happening in the space has been retained in the renovation that we did of it. So you have this very industrial cinder block wall. You have these long I-beams that are in the space that would have carried material back and forth, very heavy material with this rough concrete floor that kind of speaks to the patina of industry. And, when I invite an artist into the space, the first thing that we do is we walk around the shipyard, and you have this sense of industry, and it is still primarily maritime, and there's a lot of ships around you. And then I always also make sure that the artists get to walk in the neighborhood, because it is such a rich and incredibly diverse neighborhood that has a long history of immigration. There was the second most used entry point for immigrants in the earlier part in the 19th century, after Ellis Island was actually, in East Boston. And there is a strong history of immigration of Russian and Irish, and especially now a lot of people from Central America that are living in East Boston. And so I think for those reasons too, knowing that the neighborhood of East Boston is a neighborhood with a great history of immigration, the space itself was connected to ships, is part of the context in which artists enter the space. And I think for an artist like Chiharu Shiota, it is so resonant with themes that she has been working on for a very long time, that come from both her personal experience and her, artistic language. And so this is the sort of, this is the volume here of it completely empty. It's a free space that is open, that we run all summer. And we really try to challenge ourselves to do projects in the watershed that we couldn't do at the ICA, at the seaport, at the main museum in the seaport. And, that can mean many different things, from sort of the height to being able to literally, roll a school bus into the space, to, being able to work in such kind of different ways to really create an experience that, we don't have otherwise access to always in Boston. And so
Well,
for Chiharu, she came, it was,
before you say
yeah,
that, there's another element that's a lot of fun. We always go there because there's always a surprise. It's always fun. Because it's free, there are a lot of families who might not go into a building like a museum, but there's also a boat that takes you from the ICA to the watershed. And I think that really prepares you for a fantastic experience. It's so
yeah.
wonderful.
It is an adventure to get there. And there's also, it's great to get there by the T and walk across this beautiful park, Pierce Point Park, as well as another way to get into the space. Yeah, so when I remember I invited Chiharu, and it took a long time with her schedule to be able to figure out when she was going to be able to travel to Boston, and she ended up coming in, I think it was February, and it was so cold, and I really wanted to take her via boat across the water, so I was able to call a boat, and we took it across, and we were just frigid, and the space was quite cold. And she walked in, and she was so quiet, and she just walked around the space in total silence. And I thought, oh, what's going on? What is she thinking? And she is herself a very reflective and quiet spoken person. And, she walked around for probably 30 minutes. I answered her questions. I talked about some of the kind of logistical things. I talked about my experience having done exhibitions here. How do visitors travel through it? What are some of her ideas? And she really didn't tell me much more, and she said, we use a proposal process through the watershed. So we invite an artist for a site visit, we pay them for a proposal. And so she said, I've seen everything I need to see, and I want to go back and make some drawings. And so she went back to her hotel. We had a nice lunch, and then she went back to her studio in Berlin. And, we received, probably 8 weeks later, just this really beautiful design for a project that she had dreamed up for the space, which is really, just exactly as we had hoped it would be. And that was, and then we sort of iterated on that process, and I can share more of that story. So this was the kind of corner piece of her project, though I can say that in her initial drawings and design, it didn't look like this, and it was a conversation that we had together, but the core elements are there. And I think that they are in many ways the kind of core elements of her practice that you see in 2005 at the Rose. And I'll say, we talked about, you mentioned her talking about drawing, and she's trained in painting, she studies painting, and so many of her artistic breakthroughs in her life, I think, in part happened through travel and through encounter with different cultures. And so she's studying painting in Berlin, in Kyoto, and she gets to travel abroad to Australia, and it is there in Australia where she does a very important kind of early performance piece where she's becoming painting, and she pours red paint on her own body and is really thinking about sort of this feeling like limited by the two-dimensional quality of painting, and wanting to think about painting in space and painting as movement. And then, as you mentioned, she moves to Berlin in the 90s and 96. And Berlin in the 90s is a place of so much possibility. The wall has come down. It's incredibly inexpensive to live there. Tons of artists and curators are going there. There are these really big industrial spaces where artists are able to get inexpensive studios. And I think that sense of the possibility of sort of scaling up the practice at a moment also that she was feeling she wanted to move beyond painting really comes together in the way that she develops out of her drawing practice this idea of taking the drawn line into space through thread. And, we see it with the black thread, which I think you can connect more maybe directly to kind of a graphic line or a graphite line, but also thinking about black symbolism with, potentially death or illness or dark or mystery. And then she also does a number of installations with white thread. And then the other color she uses is red. And as many of you may know, red thread has so much significance for so many different cultures, but especially in many East Asian cultures, there is an idea of the red thread of fate, which is this kind of folk tale or belief that when one is born, there's a red thread that attaches you to who you will be with, your kind of soulmate in life. And so I think that the red thread also has so much significance for Japanese culture and for Chiharu, in this kind of way that the red thread is like a bloodline, a real sense of human connection that is interpreted through culture. So she sent a proposal. It was called Home Less Home. That remained the title of this piece and became the title of the exhibition. And it was on the one hand, all of the ingredients that we know about her work. It was this massive string installation here instead of the webbed approach that we saw in Venice or we saw at the Rose. It is using these vertical strings, which is something she's been doing increasingly. So there's kind of grid that's put on the ceiling and these are hung. But she wanted to do something she'd never done before, which is attach red and black string together to create this kind of silhouette or image of a home. And it's quite subtle to see, and you can actually see it in this image. There's this kind of black line or plane that appears to sort of cut through the piece like a pitched roof, exactly. And that was something that was very new for her. And I love working with an artist as seasoned as Chiharu and thinking about her also doing something new and the kind of experiment of that. And so, the idea is here is a home that is kind of built of nothing, right? It is just string. It doesn't have any kind of real physical form in the way that we expect of a home, but it has all of this kind of suggestion of home, first with the thread, and then with all these other elements that come in with the furniture and with this kind of torrent of paper. And if you move, I know we put so many of these beautiful images, which my colleagues have made. You can begin to kind of get a sense of it. So it developed. So, Homeless Home initially, I'm trying to think, it included this string installation and the furniture. And then it is such a massive space. And so this is a great image. I said, would it be possible to think about putting some pathways into it? And Chiharu was very excited about that idea. And I think, I knew that people were going to want to walk through it. And I thought, how do we just make that a part of the piece? And so when she was on site, we were able to kind of carve out this pathway in the string to be able to allow visitors to walk through it. And then the kind of third element that came in, which you can see here, which was not part of the original proposal, but has been something that Chiharu has been doing a lot recently, is a kind of community engagement aspect. And this came out of around 2019, she started doing a number, it actually goes before that. She was always interested in the way that objects held stories and held memories. We talked about it with that key. And I remember this really beautiful piece of hers where she asked individuals to donate their shoes, and they wrapped a story about what they had done in those shoes around it. And so, this idea that each of those shoes kind of has that experience in its kind of physical form. And so here we were excited to, and from that, she's done a number of these kind of solicitation projects. She did a project in thinking about what somebody might wish for, or a wish that they had, a hope for the world. So in this case, she was interested with Homeless Home to fill it with memories of home. And so we did sort of put an open call out for people through the ICA social media channels, through many of our partners in East Boston, who we've been working with for a long time now, to send in responses to the question of, what does home mean to you? What does it mean to create a home? What does it mean to leave it? And what does it mean to rebuild it? And those were the kind of 3 prompts that she gave for the last element of the work, which were these over 300 responses that we got to these prompts.
So are some of the responses embedded in this work?
Yeah, exactly. So
like the furniture itself is something she chose, right?
Right. Yeah. So right. Yes. So the furniture were things that she chose, and they were local furniture. She is somebody who so often travels to antique stores and flea markets and loves, objects with patina and history to them. So she had asked for a number of sets of furniture that would sort of evoke the space of home. So a dining table, a bed, a rocking chair, a desk. This is a sewing machine.
Oh, I love
and we
this.
found these locally at different stores, and would send them images to her on WhatsApp, and she would respond yes, no, something older, something with more wear and tear to it. And so we were able to put together that furniture locally, and then the arrangement of it happened on site when she was there. And
Sorry.
no, that's good. Yeah. And so here are some of the community. You can go to
No,
my
but
page.
before that,
Yeah.
Ruth, we have you here, and it's such an opportunity for me and for all our viewers to ask you. So she came in, she saw the space. 8 weeks later, she offers a sketch with some ideas. And you continue to work with her. What was that like? I mean, I know she's very shy and she doesn't talk a lot, but the going to buy furniture, finding things, understanding her vision and trying to implement it. What was that like?
Yeah. I'm always intrigued by artist studios, and, very few artists who are working at the level of Chiharu Shiota work alone. And I think it is so telling often what the kind of feel and the team is behind an artist and with the studio. And I mention that because she has had such devoted people working with her. Tomoko, who is one of her primary technical assistants, has been with her for 20 years. And so, there is a very, it's not a huge studio. I think she probably employs maybe 8 to 10 people, but there's a really wonderful and wonderfully seasoned studio. So we got Chiharu's sketch, and I immediately knew it was the one. And Jill Medvedow, who was our director at the time, I remember being so excited, and I brought it up to her, and we both just were really thrilled with the vision of it. And then became all of the practical dimensions. What are the permitting, what kind of fire treatments do we need, how do you source all of this rope, is there a way to do it more economically or environmentally? We ended up working with a rope producer based in Rhode Island, because that was going to be able to save us a lot of money and get it locally. But throughout this, it was really a slow and generative conversation. And she really is, she said, how this is going to live in the space. And she really wanted to hear that from me. So the first idea that I posed to her was this idea of the pathway. And I said, I know this is present in some of your other works. Do you think that it would be possible in this? Because I think visitors are going to want to go through the kind of field of string. And she said, yes, absolutely. And then the last kind of element to come through was this idea of the community responses. And again, that was really something that I took from her, but also I took from these really long relationships that we have had in the neighborhood, and with a number of partners who, we every year, we in the off season, they will have events at the watershed. During our installation season, they'll make sure that their groups come down, and we are just an important art site. So I knew that sort of that community element would be really a great thing to bring into the project. And it was also part of Chiharu's. So with that, I said, how do you think that could happen? And she said, well, for me, it's all about memories and how objects and how we can infuse memories. And so I think, I would like to sort of draw out people's memories of home and leave it quite open in the way that people interpreted that. And the sort of manifestation of that on a piece of paper was a sculptural proposal that she proposed during our conversation. And she has, again, this has become another very simple. It's just simple 8.5 by 11 pieces of paper here. And with the very, approach of just 2 staples, she's able to create all of these different shapes. And, many people have said to me, oh, this reminds me of like a windstorm. And there's something that feels very much like a kind of living force in the way that the paper moves and animates through the entire work.
It also looks like a kite or origami, the use of paper
Paper
to,
cranes.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
absolutely.
Exactly.
So
But
that
I
was the
wanted
process.
to
And
ask,
I'll just say quickly to end that,
yeah,
that from her kind of first drawing to, when we knew we sort of had the final form of the work, it was probably 10 months. And we, had many conversations over that time. And then there's the whole logistical component of pulling off a project like this, which is then an even, larger team at the ICA.
right. I just wanted to say that in 2005 she was using very delicate threads. And in our sculptures, you'll see she also uses very delicate threads. And here you call them ropes because it's the same kind of visual vocabulary, but she changes it according to the site, which is interesting. And the title, the first part is homeless. And we're thinking of the unhoused populations all over the world and the refugees. And, it's not just that there's a home but there aren't walls. There isn't quite a wall. It's the idea or the memory of a home. But it's also thinking of all those who don't have homes, which is, there's always that element of kind of nostalgia or longing or absence in her work. That's quite interesting.
Yeah, I think it is a play, and it's been funny. A few times we forgot the space between homeless, in writing and so forth. And I think that idea of that there could be a home where it is like minus a home, like less a home, and so what
Yeah.
is it that exactly makes a home? And I think that idea of what constitutes a home for a refugee, for an immigrant, for any person, for Chiharu, and that is really what I think the pieces of paper are filled with, is what that is represented by those people who contributed, beyond the kind of recognizable elements of the table and the chair and the kind of furniture that we can equate with the domestic space.
Yeah. Yeah. I love the way she moves from the kind of concrete, the real, to the poetic and evocative and imaginative. It's really powerful.
And we have in this installation as well, we have the red, black, and white colors still. So we have all of those colors, black through the furniture and the two threads, and then the white through the paper, that everyday object as a carrier of memory. And then I think this sense of sort of these contributions. Yeah, so as we were collecting these, and I did this with the help of colleagues at the ICA, I was so struck by these themes that emerged. And one of the first that we noticed was food, and how many, from recipes to images of meals to sharing food to grocery store aisles, that food and the idea of both kind of sustenance, but also that food is this gathering point, for a family and for people to eat together, came up a lot. And so I was struck by how often food was evoked. And here you can also just see the kind of range of contributions, from contemporary photographs to dated photographs. The top, there's a kind of collage that somebody did on the top with all those little pieces of food kind of assembled onto a table, exactly right there. So, very artistic approaches, to a recipe for apple dumplings. So that was one interesting kind of thematic.
Yeah. Food as evoking the memory of the home. I mean, that runs through literature as well. Ooh.
And then these were, the documents. And I think that, as anybody who has gone through an immigration process knows, there are so many documents. There's interminable periods of waiting. There's such a kind of bureaucracy around it. And then there's sometimes this moment of that one arrives at a sort of pivotal moment, at an inflection point in a journey. And so here, so many interesting travel documents, so many documents with different stamps. And this includes some images of different staff people who also contributed, from pictures of their families, when they, in this case, were immigrating to the US. And the top right was a really interesting contribution. These are screen grabs of WhatsApp messages. And there's an amazing law firm based in East Boston, and they work on representing individuals that are going through the immigration process that need representation. And they were some of the folks who, the group of individuals who were sent to Martha's Vineyard, if you recall, by Greg Abbott, the governor of Texas. Those individuals ultimately needed representation in the courts. And so they began to represent a lot of those Venezuelan individuals. And so these are actually screen grabs of conversations of the clients, as they are describing what it is like to live in Boston, seeing snow for the first time, what they miss about home, what it's like to be here. And so just that very presentness of currently in our country, what's happening around immigration, and the kind of, I love the juxtaposition between the WhatsApp screen grab and these kind of more, antiquated documents, to just think about how long the movement of people has been part of human history and has been part of our country's history. Right. And that sense of time span that is present in the documents was really striking.
I think that's also one of the great things about her art, that there's this human element that is timeless, but very timely. I mean, it sounds
Right.
like a paradox, but it's both. I mean, it's pretty incredible to juxtapose this with the Ellis Island, or
Mhm.
it's quite powerful. But human beings are human beings, you know, they need the bed to dream, the home to feel safe.
Oh yeah, and then I mentioned some of our long-term partners. Sam Adams Elementary School is an elementary school that's posed just up on the hill, just kind of above the shipyard, and it's a beautiful old brick building. And we've done so many partnerships with Sam Adams. So many of the classes come and visit the watershed in May at the end of their school year, and it's actually learning from our partnerships with the schools that we decided to actually keep our installations up through the end through mid-October so that we can host school groups in September, because that is a time when a lot of schools are doing field trips again. And so there were a number of different teachers at Sam Adams who wanted to participate with their classes. So I think this was a fourth or fifth grade class, who the entire class participated in the prompt and responding. And we got so many different responses of, from cats to experiences of, thinking about being from Puerto Rico. A number of the responses said, home is not a place, it's a feeling. And that was something that really sort of traced through a number of the responses from the young students. So another moment, these were so colorful too, which were so nice. And when Chiharu arrived for the installation, she got here and it had been a long flight, and she came in very early the next morning because she was so excited to get going. And the first thing she did is she sat down and she had us walk her through all 300 contributions. And she wanted to look at every one. And some of them we helped her to kind of interpret and read. And she spent hours poring over these. And she was really taken by a number of these drawings in particular.
So were these part of the papers that were hanging?
Yeah, so everything that you've seen in these slideshows are suspended in the piece. And so by being present in the piece, she very much believes that the sentiments and the memories and the ideas are also present within the piece. And because they could be quite high and hard to see, we also have two binders where people can also flip through the contributions just to be able to connect with them on a more intimate level.
Did the fourth graders come to see the
They
show?
did. Yeah, the whole class went through. My colleague Amy at the museum brought them through, and yeah, we've had a lot of groups. It's been amazing.
But it must have been thrilling for them to see that they become part of this exhibition.
I hope so. Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, I'm sure. I'm absolutely sure.
Oh, and more, yes. And then these are, the family photos, which I had expected, which is certainly when I think about what I would have contributed, which I didn't, I definitely would have gone to family photos. And one thing that was interesting with the family photos is how so often photography is linked to travel. And so many of the photos, if it's not a kind of significant moment like a wedding or a birthday, it's often a family or a couple or an extended family on a trip and travel. And I was struck by that to think about how this image of home again is one about the people and how the people can travel with you. And so home is kind of carried with you, if you might be visiting, wherever you might be visiting. So that was a something that was came through in looking through the contributions.
That's pretty incredible. That's so beautiful. And also the idea of a collective humanity, the idea of it's like harking back to dreaming now. Part of the idea was that it's not just individuals who dreams, it's societies, it's peoples, it's communities who have dreams. And the dreams aren't just, the unconscious and something that's disconnected from reality. It also has to do with how we imagine our world and our world as individuals and as a community. And I think that's really also important to the artist, and she does it in such an amazing way. So when you were hanging all of these, I know you're art handler as well because we share them. And but Was she there to kind of give instructions and shape the way it looked?
Yes, she was. And I have to say, I really saw her training in painting coming through when she was instructing the team how to install the pieces of paper. And, from the kind of side view of the work, there is this real painterly gestural quality to the way that the pieces of paper are suspended. And so she's an artist who I think very much, is knows that these installations have to be done in a certain time frame. So she's not overly kind of managing, but she was very much gesturing a lot with her hands and would say, more density there, like make it feel like it's going higher, put more energy there, like let's thin this area out. So very much almost as the pieces of paper were a kind of pigment that she was applying to the kind of three-dimensional space of the suspended rope form and field. And that was the last element, and it was such a transformation for all of us. I think
Wow.
I had to leave early one day and I came back the next morning, and it was like the piece had transformed in some ways because of this real animating force visually that the pieces of paper had. And then I wonder this animating force that they had psychically, energetically, emotionally, with thinking about how that is become part of the work.
Amazing. What an honor to work with an artist of her caliber.
And so the last element, as you mentioned, we have two installations. And this again is a space that I have learned through time is become an important artistic space. And I think in the original conception of the building, we really thought of the exhibition space kind of as that larger volume where we presented Home Less Home. But the encounter with the work, really is ideally up to the front where the visitors come in. So I invited Chiharu to, if we could reinstall this as a piece, which is a piece from 2014 called Accumulation, Searching for the Destination. And it comes from a story of her own travel to Berlin. And she brought with her one suitcase. And it was one of these old leather suitcases that probably she had inherited from her parents or had been handed down by her grandparents. And so this idea of the suitcase is sort of evoking transit and a moment of bringing one's home with them, bringing one's kind of belongings, became a source of inspiration for a number of different works that Chiharu has made over the years. Static sculptures, moving sculptures. This is a piece that has taken so many different forms, but all of them are about staggering the suitcases so that there's this sort of rise up. So as one looks at it, there seems to be an ascent of the suitcases as they exist within the space. And so we were able to install this work. What you can't tell by the still images is that some of these suitcases have a simple motor inside them. And so they kind of have this undulating movement to them, which is another part, I think, of her really thinking about the kind of experience of travel, be it turbulence, be it uncertainty, anticipation, kind of floating on the water. And so this is the first work that one encounters. And it became a great moment to think about the travel or the transit toward a destination, and Home Less Home, which is what you visit after seeing this piece, is in some ways that destination. And here you get a little bit of a view of these railroad tracks that enter into the space, that are another of its architectural artifacts of the space, as it was previously connected to a rail line that went into East Boston to deliver materials to the space. So that idea of those tracks, running under this work that is about travel was something that really enchanted Chiharu when she got to see this piece installed.
Yeah, and I think it raises different connotations because these do look like 20th, mid-20th century luggage. It's not contemporary luggage.
Mhm.
You think of the railroad tracks and, the connotations are almost inevitable. Yeah, home and having to leave home are things that are so basic to the 20th and 21st century and still powerful concepts and experiences.
And you get a good view from just of the volume, of this work. And I think that there's a way that it is. I think I've been thinking about her work in its relationship to kind of maximalism and minimalism. And there is a real this feels like a kind of field, and there's this optical experience of walking through it where, because of the alignment of the ropes at a 90 and a 45-degree angle, you almost have this kind of stuttering effect. And so I think of so many artists who have engaged space through sort of line, if it's Fred Sandback, and the way that the piece too has a really different quality kind of from the outside versus from the inside, which is really striking.
Yeah, yeah.
And that brings us perfectly to these beautiful works that you've just installed at the Rose.
So yesterday we opened, and we have two of the smaller works, and it's really interesting that, today in Boston you can see the monumental installations, two of them, and you can also see two of the smaller, more intimate, poetic sculptures. This is part of the State of Being series that is more recent. They all have these metal frames that have a kind of geometric, hard feel, but then inside you have different objects, and they're suspended within this web of strings, or they look almost like spider webs or cocoons or silk, different things. And I also have details of the two works. This one is called Diary, State of Being Diary. And you can see that the same way, you can see the relationship to Homeless Home. These are pieces of paper that are part of a diary. You can actually look through and read them, and they're all handwritten pages of a diary, all from 1912. And it's an important date in Japanese history, a date of transition from one emperor to another, from a more imperial to a well, you can read about it, but it looks like a personal diary. But if you dig in, you see that there's always a broader community meaning. Here, the white string has a totally different feeling. When I was in Japan, I saw how they make silk, how silk screens are extracted from the pupa, it's from the cocoon. It's very beautiful. And this duality, on the one side, it's it's as if the diary, the diaries are entrapped. On the other hand, it looks like they're protected, and you don't know. I mean, it's both kind and harsh at the same time. The second work is not a simple cube, it's a different geometric construction, and it's called Mask. And she uses the black strings and a kind of mask that relates to theater, relates to maybe hypocrisy, and different social elements. And I wanted to give you the context. This is a group show that has over 30 works that is called Fabricated Imaginaries, Crafting Art. And over 30 works by, dozens of global artists that have one thing in common, and that is that the works challenge categories, dissolve hierarchies, and kind of expand our understanding of what art is or can be, because they kind of occupy a liminal space between contemporary art and art traditions and craft traditions, or other objects, found objects. And the work actually sits next to, with its tension between the geometric and the more organic strings, it sits next to our Eva Hesse, beautiful Eva Hesse, that's actually from the collection of the ICA. Thank you for lending it to us. It's also a cube that looks like the modernist cube of metal, but it's interwoven with rubber tubing that looks organic. And next to it, we have a beautiful, beautiful sculpture by Hannah Levy that also has this metal frame. And on it, you have this kind of elastic element. It's also right next to Yoko Ono's cut piece and uh, um, Kusama's 1965 dress that's in our collection. So we have a lot of Japanese, Asian, but also others who employ very, very similar visual language that kind of expands what art is and what it can be. I'm going to give you the last word. Ruth, you wanted to
Well,
excite
I'll just
people?
say that I will mention to everybody that the ICA Watershed exhibition, Homeless Home, is open till through September 1st, Labor Day. We are free on Labor Day as one of our community open days. The ICA Watershed is always free. So please, if you haven't gotten a chance to see it, please come see it. This will only exist here because so many of Chiharu's installations are sort of one-time affairs that will never be fully put together again in the same way. But I will also mention that opening in September in New York and running through January is a really beautiful new exhibition called Two Home Countries that again kind of revisits this resonance of home and connection to multiple places, and through some very large scale installations, as well as another series of discrete work. So if you want more Chiharu, if you find yourself in New York, I just wanted to put a plug in for this project at the Japan Society. And I'll say that Chiharu, as you can imagine, has done a number of set designs, and there will also be a performance that done at the Japan Society with a set that's designed by Chiharu.
So I want to say that run, don't walk to, or take a boat to the watershed to see the two monumental installations that Ruth has brought to life here for us. September 1st is your last option to enjoy them. I'd love for you to come to the Rose. We opened 3 exhibitions yesterday. Uh, Fabricated Imaginaries, crafting art that has absolutely stunning work by many artists, about 30 artists, including Chiharu, but also Ellen Tsui and David Hammond and Nick Cave and Judith Chicago. I mean, it's really monumental. And Jean Shin. Oh, now I'm fretting that I won't mention anyone. And there are 2 other solo shows, one by Fred Wilson, titled Reflections. That's absolutely incredible. His first survey in over a decade, and debut museum show for Danielle McKinney, a wonderful painter. And our shows will be up until January 4th. I want to say what a pleasure it is to speak with you, Ruth, always. It's so inspiring to have colleagues in Boston who do such brilliant work, and finding out that we are many times interested in the same artists. And uh, over the last 2 decades, Chiharu Shiota came to Boston twice, which is lovely. So
Thank
thank you,
you so
Ruth.
much, Gannit, and thanks everybody for joining us tonight.
Thanks for joining us, and thank you, Maddie and Menen, for being with us.